Long before the warm Georgia sun glistened on his backyard pool, long before the manicured lawns and winding roads of Willow Creek became familiar paths, Samuel Bryant had lived another life, one defined by duty, by sacrifice, and by quiet perseverance. As he sat by the edge of his pool, gazing at the reflection of the sky, a slow smile touched his lips. It wasn't just the view that stirred something deep within him, it was everything that had come before. Every moment, every hardship, every lesson had led him here. Samuel had grown up on the rougher side of Atlanta, in a modest brick home squeezed between crumbling duplexes and aging storefronts. His mother, a schoolteacher with a backbone forged from hardship, taught him the value of education, kindness, and resilience. His father, a veteran who wore his medals with quiet dignity, passed down lessons not through lectures but through living examples, staying calm under pressure, treating everyone with fairness, and knowing when to stand your ground. "Strength isn't loud, son," his father would say, polishing his scuffed leather boots at the kitchen table. "It's quiet. It's what you do when no one's watching." Those words had followed Samuel into adulthood. They whispered to him during long patrol nights when fear crept into the cracks of his resolve. They steadied his hands during confrontations that threatened to spiral out of control. And, most of all, they molded the man who would later become a cornerstone of his community, even when others tried to tear him down. Samuel had spent 15 years as a police officer, navigating neighborhoods where tension could ignite with a single wrong glance. Over time, he'd seen the best and worst humanity had to offer. He'd cradled wounded victims in his arms, talked desperate souls off ledges, and faced down more than a few hostile glares simply for wearing a badge while being a black man. But through it all, he remained resolute. His badge was never a weapon, it was a promise, a vow to protect and to serve, no matter who stood before him. When he finally hung up his uniform, Samuel made a quiet promise to himself: he would build a life that honored his parents' sacrifices and his years of service. Buying a home in Willow Creek wasn't just a real estate transaction, it was a testament to everything he had fought for. A space of peace. A symbol that perseverance could indeed yield fruit. But peace, he knew, was not something that would simply be handed to him. It had to be defended, not with fists or anger, but with the kind of steadfastness that couldn't be shaken by ignorance or malice. As he remembered his father's voice, Samuel smiled a little wider. He could almost feel the comforting weight of that hand on his shoulder, hear that steady reassurance: when the storm comes, son, you don't run. You plant your feet. You face it. And you remind yourself who you are. The incident with HOA Officer Deborah Langley was not Samuel's first encounter with unjust authority, nor would it be his last. But now, as then, he would face it the way he always had, with unwavering dignity. He looked at the empty yard, knowing it wouldn't be empty for long. Knowing that, even as others plotted behind closed doors, the strength within him, built from generations who had survived, persevered, and risen, was more than enough. He was not just protecting a pool or a piece of property. He was protecting a legacy. And he was ready. The first signs of trouble didn't explode all at once, they seeped quietly into Brandon's new life, like hairline fractures in a seemingly flawless foundation. At first, they were almost laughable: the way Cynthia accidentally parked her luxury SUV halfway into Brandon's driveway, or how she mistakenly received his mail but somehow took days to return it. Small things. Things you could almost excuse, if you were determined enough to cling to optimism. Brandon tried to brush it off. After all, moving into a new neighborhood always involved some friction, didn't it? People needed time to adjust, he reasoned. Besides, he had faced far worse hostility during his years on the force. Surely he could handle a nosy neighbor with too much free time and too little kindness. But deep down, a quiet unease began to stir, a sensation like the low rumble before a distant storm. One evening, while grilling in his backyard, Brandon noticed Cynthia standing on her second-story balcony, phone in hand, pretending to be on a call while very obviously recording him. Their eyes met. She didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. She simply turned her back and continued her surveillance as if it were her right. The next morning, Brandon awoke to find a printed letter tucked under his door. It wasn't from the HOA board, it was anonymous, typed neatly in Times New Roman, almost sterile in tone. Certain residents have expressed concerns about activities that might lower neighborhood standards. We trust you will act accordingly. There was no signature. No official stamp. Just a message steeped in cowardice and veiled hostility. Brandon laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind of hollow chuckle you let out when you realize the battle might be much uglier than you first believed. And yet, he stayed calm. He remembered something his father once told him during a hard time in his life: sometimes, the greatest form of power is silent dignity. You don't need to roar to show your strength. That evening, Brandon double-checked the locks on his back gate. He adjusted the angles of his security cameras to cover more ground. Not out of fear. Out of principle. He wouldn't be bullied out of his own home. Brandon knew that the art of enduring petty provocations was something he had perfected over the years. But what he hadn't yet realized was that Cynthia Holloway wasn't playing by the old rules of neighborly decency. No, Cynthia was prepared to cross lines that most people instinctively respected. It began with the newspaper. Each morning, Brandon would step outside, coffee in hand, ready to enjoy his daily ritual of flipping through the local news by the poolside. But 3 mornings in a row, the newspaper had vanished. At first, he thought it was just a delivery issue, maybe misplaced, maybe blown away by the Georgia wind. But on the 4th morning, while sipping his coffee on the porch, he caught a glimpse. Cynthia, clad in her designer robe, scurrying across his driveway at dawn, snatching the paper like a mischievous child stealing cookies before dinner. Brandon watched, silent and stunned, as she tucked it under her arm and strolled back across her lawn with an exaggerated air of innocence. The sheer audacity almost made him laugh. But there was a difference between amusement and tolerance. And Brandon Carter had reached the point where silence was no longer a strategy, it was becoming complicity. The second incident was worse. It was a Thursday afternoon when Brandon returned from the grocery store to find something chilling. His prized rose bushes he had lovingly planted along the fence, tended with almost ritualistic devotion, were withering, their once vibrant petals turning brown and curling at the edges. Puzzled, Brandon knelt beside the flower bed. The soil smelled wrong, chemical, sharp, unnatural. Alarmed, he reviewed the previous night's security footage. There, under the ghostly glow of the backyard lights, was Cynthia, hood pulled low, tiptoeing along the property line. In her gloved hand was a bottle, and with methodical cruelty, she was pouring something into the roots. The anger that flared within Brandon wasn't the hot, uncontrollable kind. It was colder. Sharper. More resolute. He didn't storm across the lawn demanding an explanation. He didn't pound on her door or shout through her window. No, Brandon knew better. He understood that people like Cynthia thrived on emotional chaos, they wielded it like a weapon, twisting the narrative to portray themselves as victims. Instead, he documented every second. Every angle. He wasn't just preparing for a confrontation anymore, he was preparing for vindication. The human spirit can withstand 1,000 small cuts before it finally bleeds out a response. For Brandon Carter, that response was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. The last straw came on a Saturday morning, under a sun that painted everything golden and serene, a morning that should have been filled with nothing more than the gentle lap of pool water and the faint clink of a coffee spoon. But serenity was shattered when Brandon noticed muddy footprints leading from his back gate to the pool. Fresh footprints. Small but deliberate. Following them with a cold sense of dread, he found the evidence he couldn't have even imagined. Cynthia Holloway, in her designer sandals and oversized sunglasses, was standing by the pool edge, waving her arms frantically while trying to usher two teenage boys out of the water. "Get out! Now!" she hissed at them in a furious whisper. Brandon stood there, frozen for half a second, before striding forward, the quiet power of a man who had seen enough. "Cynthia," he called out, his voice slicing through the humid morning air like a blade, "care to explain why you're trespassing on my property, again, and why you brought guests?" She jumped, startled, then spun around with a smirk that barely concealed her embarrassment. "They're just kids. We needed somewhere clean and private for them to swim. This neighborhood used to be about community." She said it like an accusation, as if Brandon were the villain for daring to own his own home. Brandon's fists tightened slightly by his sides, but his face remained composed. "I don't recall giving permission," he said, voice calm but resonating with an unmistakable finality. "And I certainly don't remember asking you to manage my guest list." The boys, who Brandon realized were likely Cynthia's nephews or perhaps her friend's sons, scrambled out of the pool, looking anywhere but at him, red-faced with embarrassment. Cynthia crossed her arms and tried one last desperate play. "You're overreacting," she said, the practiced condescension dripping from her words. "This pool is barely used anyway. You're being unreasonable." Brandon didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. Instead, he stepped back and pulled out his phone. "Then I guess the HOA board would be very interested to see the footage from this morning," he said, tapping the screen with slow, deliberate movements. "Especially since this is the third time you've used my property without consent, and now you've involved minors." The effect was instantaneous. Cynthia's bravado crumbled like a sandcastle in high tide. Her eyes darted around, calculating, desperate. She muttered something about a misunderstanding, about intentions being good, but her voice was fading into the background noise of her defeat. Brandon said nothing more. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet, immovable resolve, as Cynthia gathered her things and retreated, the two boys trailing behind her, dripping shame onto the pavement. As the gate swung closed with a soft metallic click, Brandon exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. This wasn't just about a petty neighbor with a sense of entitlement larger than the sky. It was about respect. It was about boundaries. It was about reclaiming the simple dignity that every human being deserved to enjoy, without fear of being undermined or harassed in their own home. Enough was enough. And now, Brandon Carter was going to teach Cynthia Holloway, and anyone like her, that no amount of entitlement could withstand the steady, quiet force of righteous action. This was not revenge. This was justice, wrapped in calm, delivered with precision, and served cold. The game had changed. And Brandon was no longer playing defense. When Brandon Carter closed the gate behind Cynthia Holloway that morning, he knew this was no longer about tolerating a nuisance neighbor. This was about making a statement, not with anger, not with chaos, but with intelligence, patience, and a strategic mind honed over years of public service. As he walked back into his house, still dripping faint footprints across the polished wood floors, an idea began to crystallize in his mind. It was not born of vengeance. It was born of principle. Brandon spent the rest of the afternoon in his office, a modest room lined with shelves of law enforcement memoirs, framed photos of fallen comrades, and certificates of commendation. A space that reminded him of who he was, and more importantly, who he refused to become. Pulling out a notepad, he began to map it out carefully. Step 1, documentation. He already had hours of footage, Cynthia peeking over his fence, slipping through his back gate, lounging by his pool like a queen surveying her domain. But he needed more. He needed undeniable proof tied to the moment she would cross the final line. Step 2, the bait. Brandon realized something crucial. Cynthia wasn't motivated by necessity, she was motivated by entitlement. The more he denied her access, the more obsessed she became with reclaiming what she saw as hers. So, he decided, he wouldn't deny her anymore. He would invite her. Not openly, of course. No, he would set a trap subtle enough for Cynthia to believe she had outsmarted him. The next day, Brandon took action. He purposefully left his back gate slightly ajar during the afternoon, just enough to catch the attention of a watchful neighbor. He left a colorful pool float and a new set of loungers by the pool, arranged invitingly as if he were preparing for a grand party. But most importantly, he posted on the neighborhood Facebook group. "Hey neighbors. Been doing some pool maintenance and upgrades. Can't wait to have guests over again soon. This place is finally starting to feel like home. No direct invitation. No permission. Just enough bait for someone like Cynthia to smell opportunity like a bloodhound on a trail." Meanwhile, Brandon spent the evening meticulously installing 2 new hidden cameras, one overlooking the side yard, one aimed directly at the gate latch. He didn't want a single second missed. Not this time. He also took one final precaution. He ordered a special kind of harmless, non-permanent pool dye. The kind that reacts only when specific compounds are introduced: perfumes, luxury sunscreens, certain oils, all favorites of Cynthia and her high society friends. By Friday evening, the trap was set. The stage was ready. The audience was gathering, they just didn't know it yet. Brandon didn't need to wait long. By Saturday morning, word around the neighborhood was buzzing. Brandon's finally opening his pool. Did you see all the new furniture? Maybe he's throwing a party. I heard he's letting people stop by casually. None of these statements was true. But in a community where rumor travels faster than reality, truth rarely mattered to those who already believed what they wanted to believe. Cynthia Holloway was among those believers. And she wasn't going to miss her chance. From his upstairs window, Brandon watched through a thin slit in the curtains as Cynthia gathered a few of her usual cohorts, 3 women in oversized sunglasses, floppy sun hats, and expensive beach totes. He watched her saunter confidently down the sidewalk, a bottle of champagne tucked under her arm. He watched the gate creak open, a slow, self-satisfied push as if daring the world to question her right to be there. And he watched them all pile into the backyard, laughing, clinking glasses, and slathering themselves in sunscreen that cost more than Brandon's monthly utility bills. But this time, the pool had a surprise for them. Within minutes of splashing around and lounging luxuriously, faint greenish swirls began to emerge around them. The chemical reaction was slow, at first, subtle. But the sun was mercilessly bright, and soon the color blossomed into an unmistakable hue, tinting their arms, their legs, even their expensive swimsuits. The scene unfolded like slow-motion poetry. Shrieks. Gasps. Scrambling. One woman dropped her champagne flute into the pool, another lost her hat to the wind as she bolted for the gate, and Cynthia, the ringleader, stood frozen at first, staring in horror at her reflection in the shimmering water, now tainted with a brilliant emerald hue. Her shriek cut through the suburban stillness like a fire alarm. "What have you done to us?" she wailed. But Brandon didn't come outside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because every moment, every splash, every panicked retreat was caught perfectly on high-definition video. And soon, it would be shared not just with the HOA, but with the entire community. Justice was no longer an idea. It was unfolding, beautifully, inevitably, right before his eyes. As the last of the emerald-tinted figures bolted from his yard, leaving trails of green footprints down the pristine sidewalks, Brandon Carter leaned back in his chair, his arms folded loosely across his chest, and simply smiled. It wasn't a smile of cruelty. It wasn't even a smile of victory. It was a quiet, private moment of justice realized. For once, the narrative hadn't been twisted against him. For once, the truth stood in the bright Georgia sun for all to see, undeniable and unfiltered. The footage was better than Brandon had dared hope. Multiple camera angles. Clear shots of faces. Crystal clear audio capturing every mocking word Cynthia and her friends had spoken about him before the die set in. Brandon didn't rush. He wasn't driven by spite. Instead, with the methodical precision of a seasoned investigator, he compiled the clips into a short, devastating video. It opened with quiet footage. Cynthia trespassing. Cynthia partying. Cynthia scoffed at warnings. Then, the grand reveal, the green eruption in the pool, the shrieks, the chaos, the mad dash through the neighborhood. The final shot. A freeze frame of Cynthia, dripping green, her mouth mid-scream, one hand clawing desperately at her ruined designer hat. The caption Brandon added was simple, almost gentle. When you trespass once, it's an accident. When you trespass twice, it's a choice. When you trespass 3 times, karma books a front row seat. By Sunday evening, the video had made its rounds through the neighborhood WhatsApp group. By Monday morning, it was quietly circulating on local community Facebook pages. By Tuesday, it was viral. Brandon never once shared it beyond his immediate community, he didn't need to. Once unleashed, a story this satisfying had a life of its own. Within days, the ripple effects became impossible to ignore. First, there were the whispers. Neighbors who once hesitated to even wave now crossed the street to shake Brandon's hand, or drop off homemade cookies with sheepish smiles. Some shared their tales of Cynthia's past offenses, calling code enforcement over Halloween decorations, complaining about unsightly cars in driveways, even trying to get a neighbor fined for letting their dog bark too loudly. It seemed Cynthia's reign of passive-aggressive terror had been longer, and darker, than Brandon ever knew. Then came the formal fallout. The HOA president, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Whitaker, sent Brandon a private message requesting a meeting. When Brandon arrived, he found not just Mr. Whitaker, but half the board waiting, along with a printed transcript of the video, complete with timestamps. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Carter, first let me apologize. We should have intervened earlier. We allowed personal relationships to cloud our judgment. That's over now." He slid a document across the table, an official reprimand against Cynthia Holloway for repeated trespassing, harassment, and conduct unbecoming of a community member. She was fined heavily. Her voting rights in the HOA were suspended indefinitely. And if another complaint was filed against her, she would be facing forced removal proceedings, the ultimate HOA consequence. Brandon didn't gloat. He simply nodded, thanked the board for doing the right thing, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air feeling lighter than he had in months. But the universe wasn't done yet. The local news station caught wind of the story, not from Brandon, but from an anonymous tipster. They contacted him requesting an interview, but Brandon politely declined. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He didn't want to be a meme. He wanted his life back. Quiet. Peaceful. Honest. Just as he had dreamed when he first stepped into his little slice of suburban paradise. Still, the news segment aired, showing blurry footage of green-streaked women bolting from a backyard, paired with commentary about the perils of entitled behavior and the importance of respecting property rights. And if you looked closely, very closely, you could see Brandon's pool float bobbing serenely in the background, untouched, unbothered. It became an accidental symbol. A small, quiet beacon of dignity. Meanwhile, Cynthia Holloway's world unraveled. Her real estate listings dried up almost overnight. Clients canceled showings. Her agency quietly removed her profile from their website. Neighbors who once tolerated her antics now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. At PTA meetings, book clubs, and garden parties, her name was whispered not with admiration, but with pity, or worse, with amusement. No one said it to her face. But everyone knew. In a world addicted to justice, green was now the color of karma. And Brandon? He threw the biggest barbecue the neighborhood had ever seen. Children laughed as they splashed in the once again crystal-clear pool. Parents mingled over ribs and sweet tea. Old grudges were buried. New friendships blossomed. And as the sun set behind the rows of manicured lawns, Brandon raised a glass of lemonade to his guests and simply said, "Here's to standing up, calmly, wisely, when it matters most." In the weeks that followed the chaos, a quiet but unmistakable shift transformed the neighborhood. Where there had once been wary glances and tight-lipped conversations, now there were open gates, easy laughter, and invitations that flowed like the sweet tea at Brandon's legendary barbecues. It was as if, with one vivid splash of color, the invisible barriers that had divided the residents for years had been washed away. Neighbors who had lived side by side for a decade without exchanging more than nods now lingered over picket fences, swapping recipes and trading stories about their children. Mr. Whitaker and his wife, once considered distant and reserved, now hosted impromptu Friday night gatherings under string lights that twinkled like fireflies in the soft Georgia twilight. The Rodriguez twins, whose family had once been whispered about for being too different, became regulars at Brandon's pool, practicing cannonballs and racing laps under his patient, watchful eye. Even old Mrs. Donnelly, who had earned a reputation for writing anonymous HOA complaints, surprised everyone by knitting handmade welcome mats for every new family who moved in. The spirit of the community wasn't built on dramatic speeches or grand declarations. It grew quietly, organically, from small acts of kindness, a borrowed cup of sugar, an offer to mow a neighbor's lawn while they were sick, a warm plate of peach cobbler delivered just because. Brandon watched it all unfold from his patio, a book often in his lap, his beloved Labrador, Samson, snoozing at his feet. He felt a profound satisfaction, not from Cynthia's fall, but from the neighborhood's rise. This was the life he had fought so hard to build. Not just a house with a pool. Not just an address in an upscale zip code. But a place where he, a black man, a former officer, a quiet dreamer, could belong. Fully. Freely. Joyfully. One evening, as the cicadas sang their sleepy song and the scent of jasmine floated through the air, Brandon hosted a community movie night in his backyard. Neighbors brought lawn chairs and blankets, parents corralled sticky-fingered kids armed with popcorn buckets bigger than their heads, and a giant white sheet fluttered gently against the side of the house, ready for the projector's first frame. As the opening credits of an old feel-good classic rolled, Brandon glanced around at the sea of smiling faces illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. A lump formed in his throat. He hadn't just defended his right to peace. He had, without realizing it, planted the seeds of something greater. Community. Resilience. Hope. And somewhere, perhaps in a cramped apartment across town, Cynthia Holloway nursed her bitterness, not understanding that the greatest consequence of her actions wasn't humiliation or financial loss. It was exclusion from the very kind of vibrant, welcoming community she had claimed to protect, but had only ever tried to control. For Brandon, there was no need for revenge. No gloating. No endless replays of the viral video. He chose instead to live his life as the best rebuttal to every slight, every prejudice, every whispered doubt he had ever faced. Sometimes he would catch sight of the framed photo he had hung discreetly near his back door, the image of green-tinted figures fleeing in panic, and he would smile, not in mockery, but in gentle reminder. "Stand your ground," it seemed to whisper. "But do it with grace. Do it with dignity. Do it in a way that leaves the world a little better than you found it." That summer stretched into autumn, and the bonds Brandon had helped forge only grew stronger. Families once isolated now planned joint holidays. Children formed impromptu sports teams, their laughter echoing through the streets. Even HOA meetings, once dreaded battlegrounds, turned into cooperative sessions where real improvements were made, a new playground installed, holiday markets organized, scholarships funded for local students. And through it all, Brandon remained the quiet heart at the center of it. He never sought the spotlight. Never demanded recognition. But the neighborhood knew. They saw him. And in small, subtle ways, they made sure he knew they were grateful. A thank you note slipped into his mailbox. A bottle of sweet tea was left on his porch. A hand on his shoulder during a quiet moment at a block party, saying, simply, "You changed things." As the seasons changed and the leaves turned to brilliant gold and crimson, Brandon found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, to this home, this neighborhood, this moment of profound peace. It was never about the pool. It was never even about Cynthia Holloway and her campaigns of resentment. It was about something deeper, something that too often got lost in the rush of daily life. The right to live freely. The right to be respected. The right to belong, not because of appearance, wealth, or background, but because of shared humanity. One evening, as the sun set in hues of fiery orange behind the silhouette of his home, Brandon sat by the pool, now restored to its pristine blue, and listened to the sounds of his neighborhood. Laughter. Children chasing fireflies. Music floating from a backyard radio. This, he thought, is what home is supposed to feel like. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Sofia Rodriguez, the teenager who lived across the street. She held a tray of fresh-baked cookies, her eyes shining with the kind of earnestness that only youth possesses. "My mom said to say thank you," she said shyly. "For standing up. For showing us all how to be brave." Brandon smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Sophia. But the real courage," he said, "is in the little choices. Like choosing kindness when it's easier to turn away. Like choosing to speak up, even when you're scared." She beamed and ran back across the street, the tray now lighter in his hands but his heart heavier, not with sadness, but with gratitude. The lessons of that summer, and everything that followed, remained etched in Brandon's mind. He had learned that true victory isn't loud. It isn't about crushing your enemies or basking in applause. True victory is quiet. It's waking up every morning and knowing you didn't let hatred or fear define you. It's living in a way that lifts others, even those who once tried to tear you down. It's about choosing, over and over again, to respond to injustice not with vengeance, but with dignity, strength, and an open heart. Brandon never wished Cynthia ill. He hoped, quietly, that one day she would learn, that she would realize fences built from fear are far lonelier than walls torn down by love. Maybe, somewhere, she would have her moment of reflection. Maybe not. Either way, it no longer burdened him. One Saturday, nearly a year to the day since Cynthia had first trespassed into his backyard, Brandon hosted another barbecue, this time larger than ever. Tables overflowed with food from every culture imaginable: tamales, collard greens, biryani, spaghetti, lumpia, fried chicken, and dumplings. Neighbors wore colorful clothes, children splashed in the pool, and the air pulsed with life and joy. As dusk settled, Brandon stood up to make a small toast, nothing grand, just a few words from the heart. "I just want to say," he began, voice steady but thick with emotion, "thank you. Thank you for choosing community over division. Thank you for showing that real strength comes not from pushing people out, but from bringing people in." He raised his glass. "Here's to us. To every stubborn, brave, beautiful act of kindness that brought us together." A cheer went up, glasses clinked, and music filled the air once again. Later, as the stars blanketed the night sky and the last of the guests trickled home, Brandon lingered by the pool. He looked around at his home, his community, his little piece of hard-won peace, and he smiled. He hadn't just survived the storm. He had built something stronger because of it. He had planted roots so deep that no amount of hatred, ignorance, or fear could ever uproot them. And so, as he dipped his feet into the water, feeling the coolness lap against his skin, Brandon whispered into the night. This is just the beginning. Not just for him. Not just for his neighborhood. But for everyone willing to believe that light is stronger than darkness, love is stronger than hate, and dignity always, always wins in the end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a little reminder about the power of kindness, and subscribe for more true tales of strength, community, and hope. Together, we make the world a little brighter, one story, one act of courage, one neighborly smile at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey.